In the story of the prodigal son, the younger son loses his way. But ultimately, he returns home. Others, besides me, have taken a little creative license when they retell this story. The creative license I have most heard is changing that ending of the story. Some people don't like that the younger brother just waltzes back home and not only isn't punished for his bad choices, but his father uses what essentially belongs to that loyal older brother to throw a party for this jerk. If you have siblings, you might have a sense of who you are in this story. Or if you have children, you might have a sense of which kid is which. But the ending that people sometimes rewrite is that when the younger son returns home from this period of betrayal and debauchery, that the father welcomes him, but instead of throwing a party for the newly returned son, the father celebrates the older son who never left. But I like to keep the original ending. But in my prequel to the prodigal son's story, as these two boys were growing up in the ancient Near East, I imagine that their father read often to them this sweet book that we heard today by Nancy Tillman, On the Night You Were Born. Maybe this father read that story over and over, and the boys would plead with him all the time, "Daddy, read us again the book with the polar bears dancing." And the father would always comply, even though he worked a very hard day, even though there was still lots of work to do before he could go to bed. And as the father would turn to that final page, he'd look at his boys directly in the eyes and say by memory, "Heaven blew every trumpet and played every horn on the wonderful, marvelous night you were born." And the father would feel the weight and truth of those words and the immense love he had for each of his boys. And so, imagine his heartbreak when one of his beloveds became estranged and lost. And imagine his joy when that lost son returned home. Many of you know that I was born and raised here in Wilmington. Now, just to be clear, I am not the lost prodigal child in this story. But the first time I ever entered this sanctuary, it was the 1980s. And I was a teenager. I was a student at St. Mark's High School. I was a lifelong Roman Catholic at that point. I had no idea what Unitarian Universalism was. It was a weekday, and I had a summer job working at the Educational Enrichment Center. And I don't know why I walked from the daycare into this sanctuary. I remember that I was by myself, and looking at the sort of layout of the building, I'm guessing I kind of overshot the office. Maybe I was trying to drop something off or something. But I walked into this space from that doorway back there. And even though I had never been in a Unitarian Universalist church, I knew that this room was a sanctuary. I knew it was a sanctuary because, like all the other sanctuaries I had known, it was kind of big for a room, kind of grand. It had pews, rows and rows of pews. It had a very large pulpit, which I think was much larger than this pulpit. And it had a certain look about it. And I remember that I paused when I crossed into the threshold of this room. It was clearly a very different space from the hallway, from the daycare, from outside. And I remember that I looked up, which I think is the intention behind churches having these high ceilings that churches sometimes have, so that we might look up from time to time in our lives. And without knowing anything about Unitarian Universalism, I knew immediately that this was a place where holiness lived. I knew that if some mother, father, God existed, that they could be found, if nowhere else, right here in this room. I remember that I walked to a center aisle, faced the chancel, and genuflected, which is what Catholics do when they enter a worship space: kneel, make the sign of the cross, and then I went back to work. And it would be almost 20 years before I would enter this sanctuary again. In those 20 years, I experienced high school and college graduation. I earned 2 master's degrees, one in performance art and one in divinity. I lived in the San Francisco Bay Area for 10 of those years. I was married and divorced in that time. In that 20 years, I left the Roman Catholic Church of my childhood and experimented with other forms of Christianity, with Buddhism, Wiccan, Toltec spirituality, Hinduism, and Judaism. When I returned again to this sanctuary, it was 2006. I had returned to Delaware to spend a year in a chaplain residency program at Christiana Care. I was religiously adrift at that point, despite having a seminary degree and feeling very called to ministry. My liberal Quaker chaplaincy supervisor told me I was Unitarian Universalist and I needed to go figure that out. And so, one Sunday morning, I came here to this sanctuary. For the first time in my life, I walked through what were a pair of very heavy wooden doors that once occupied the threshold of this space. I sat in a pew, and I knew that I was finally home. Now, I wasn't here more than a few months before I decided to move to Texas to help my brother and sister-in-law care for their children. But this community made enough of an impact that I continued my preparations for Unitarian Universalist ministry. As soon as I got to Texas, I found a local Unitarian Universalist congregation and joined. A few years later, I received my ministerial fellowship with the Unitarian Universalist Association, and I became the minister of a Unitarian Universalist congregation in Denton, Texas. And over the years since then, I have returned from time to time to this sanctuary, usually would sit quietly toward the back. And on one such visit about 5 years ago, my parents were both navigating some health issues, and I was in Wilmington for a couple of weeks to help them out. And the Sunday I was here, it was a youth-led Sunday, and each of the youth were talking about their favorite color. And one person talked about yellow, because yellow was the color of his favorite flower, the dandelion. And he talked about how dandelions kind of get couched as weeds, but they have the power to make a boring green lawn look extraordinary. And I thought about my life, and I thought about my struggles, and in that hour, I found my center and my strength, and I found something of beauty. It did not occur to me then that I would ever be the minister of this church. What did occur to me is that this church would always be a place where I could find home. And it wouldn't matter that the ceiling was high or that the sermon was spot on. It wouldn't matter if we sang on or off key. Scott, I know you might disagree with that, but it wouldn't matter if the furniture had been changed out or the floors redone. It would still be home. Because home is not a place outside of us, but that place inside where we refuse to stay lost. This room itself is not home, but it's a space we come to over and over again so that we can return home to our own wholeness and our own holiness. It's a place where we can return to some inherent, authentic sense of self. A self that the world celebrated when we were born. That's right, the world celebrated you when you were born. Home is the place where we find God or spirit or love or life with a capital L, where we remember clearly how incredibly precious this life is and the lives of those around us. Home is that place where we forget to feel too busy for what matters in our life, where we stop being wound up in petty disagreements. Home might be the place where you can stay in recovery instead of addiction, the place where desire for material wealth goes away, the place where instead of fear and clinging and short-term feel-goods, we remember to look up or out. Home is where we find inspiration and strength to bring about justice in the world, and we develop the motivation to fight for what is right. And our religious work is to stay grounded in that interior home, even when the world feels like it is spiraling out of control, even when there's change all around, even when your beloved is lost, even in the midst of pain and uncertainty. Ram Dass, a wise spiritual leader, once said that we are all just walking each other home. And in that sense, home is about some kind of unity with the divine that we encounter at death. But no matter what you believe about the afterlife, we might all agree that our work together is simply to help each other journey well toward death, which is to say we're all just helping each other live each day well. That's our work together. Back in April and May, when I was candidating to be your minister, I got to return again to this building. The pews were still here then, and during one of those meet and greets, someone asked me, "What do you think about movable chairs in the sanctuary?" That wasn't a loaded question, was it? And I admitted that I did not have an opinion about movable chairs until I was officiating a wedding a few years ago in the congregation I served in Denton, Texas. One of the women in this couple moved through life in a wheelchair, and I was so grateful that we had already built a ramp up to the chancel some years before. And I was especially grateful when, on the day of the wedding, ushers could remove chair after chair from that sanctuary as we realized that there were a great number of guests who were also showing up in wheelchairs. We quickly widened an aisle, and we created places where folks could sit with whomever they wanted, wherever they needed, not bound by unmovable seating. And I realized then that sanctuaries should be places where there is room for everyone. This past week, as I have come and gone from this room, I have felt the expansiveness of this space. Not just how big the room feels without pews in it, but how big the welcome feels with automated doors and movable chairs, a lift to get from one floor to another, a ramp where stairs used to be. This congregation also made a conscious choice to remove those big carved doors from the threshold, acknowledging both a desire for better physical accessibility through those doors, but also acknowledging that the doors' carvings of our white forefathers were a distraction to the anti-racism work that we are committed to and that our country desperately needs us to stay committed to. And I know those doors had deep value and meaning for so many of you. They are part of this congregation's long history here in Wilmington. And I admire what it took for you to make that choice to move them out of the way. Part of our work as a congregation is to create more and more space for people to find home, to create space where they can get in touch with the fullness of their humanity, the radiance of their spirit. This space should be a space where everyone can find their home. In the story of the prodigal son, there's so much focus on that final arrival of the son into his father's arms. What if the real moment in that story, though, is when that son is laying in the mud, eating leftover scraps of food, when he suddenly remembers who and what he is? What if that is the peak moment, where this son is no longer lost, but instead really clear and at peace? And he senses his future opening up with love. And he can hear once again the wind whispering his name and the geese singing his song. That, right there, is the moment when he is finally home. His father's embrace was simply that affirmation that the world wishes for our homecoming and longs for us to find our way to our best, most loving version of ourselves. May we, in this day, allow our hearts to return to that holy, holy place. I invite you to rise as you are able and sing with me hymn number 1008, When Our Heart is in a Holy Place.